So a bit of my background is I've been in academia for quite a while, but I've also kept full-time jobs while doing university and college and stuff like that too. So most of my experience though is as an autonomous agents researcher, as a human-robot interaction researcher, and now I'm a security and privacy researcher. But around that I've also done software development, I've done hardware development, I've basically keep myself entirely too busy. So I'm coming at this topic from both sides, but mainly from the academic side. So the perspective as I go through the slides will be from academic, because I imagine that's probably not what most of you are, but we'll see. So the major issue here, like, what is it? And it all starts with research. When I get my undergrads, this is usually what they think research is. It's like, you choose a topic, you read some materials, you develop a plan about like how you're gonna do your research, you experiment with it a bit, you review what you did wrong, change the idea a bit, and keep going. But it usually ends up being like, nah, you modify the topic heavily, and then eventually you'll go through developing plan, experiment, but then again, maybe sometimes you go to reviewing your shortcomings and realizing, dang, I think I read something about this somewhere, and you jump there. Or you develop a plan and then you go immediately to expanding or contracting your scope because you realize your idea is so bad. And it goes over and over like this, where you end up hopping around the circle. You don't really do all the steps in order, which from industry, this usually looks more like, hate to say it, but agile. Jumping around, prototyping, this sort of thing. But in academia, this is a little bit slower of a process, especially when you get ethics in and stuff like that. But in the end, both groups will have some sort of research that they do want to show off, that they do want to get into the hands of other people, that they do want to spread the knowledge through. But like, how do we do this? And how do you get from industry to academia and back and forth? Because the major problem right now is there's not very good communication between the two groups. You end up getting a lot of situations where there are paywalls between academia and industry, where it can be really hard for somebody to get access to really controversial research that might be happening in academia that is supported by academia, but could never get money in industry. Or in industry, you see some really cool tools being made, but this school won't buy it and stuff like that. So there's all these things back and forth that could really help both groups, but there's always kind of this ravine between the two. So throughout the rest of this talk, I'm gonna try and help equip everybody here to get over that ravine and get the information they need in really interesting ways. And part of this is first understanding, like, how does academia work? Like, what actually motivates an academic? And it's pretty much citations. And hopefully, like, you can see here, like, who is probably the better researcher, who might be a researcher that's been around for a while, all this sort of stuff. Because you can see, like, citations at 13,000, like, that's pretty intense. Or 58, right? So getting those citations is how researchers get their money, because the more citations you have, the more reach for your research, the more people know about you, the more grants are willing to actually fund you. So this is why in Canada it's a little different. We don't have to do grants that often. We get to keep all of the money. We don't have to share with the school. There's nothing like that. So, and the grants are usually fairly large as well, so we don't have to do it as often, but it's still something that, especially when you're starting out as a researcher or you're hoping to start a new program, that you have to have all these citations to make the major government funders actually want to fund you. So this is what drives everything, because your citation count also makes people want to work with you more, because they're like, this person's prolific, they know how to write a paper, look at all these citations. They're like, nah, I get other people to write my papers for me. And that'll happen often as well. So it does show kind of like your clout. It's an easy clout score for academics. But then the interesting thing with academics is this is the life cycle of your research. Is like, you do your research, but once that's done, you become an author. You try and get into a conference, especially in computer science. Conferences are much more important than journals. They're also quicker, but not as quick as industry. So you try and get into the conference, but the conference will be like, okay, reviewers, review this for me. The reviewers will come back to the author and be like, hey, your stuff sucks, can you fix it? And that happens entirely too frequently. No one likes reviewer number 2. They tend to be the most angry. But then it goes through the cycle over and over and over until you finally get it published. But sometimes that means hopping to a second tier conference, which not as many people see, which doesn't get you as many citations. So you always try and present in the top tier first or get that paper in there. Sometimes it means waiting a year because a lot of the conferences that people want to submit to only accept once a year. And so if you want to get your research published, it's all of a sudden you're waiting for so long, because if you finish it the month after a conference is done, that's it. You have to wait. If it doesn't get in, you have to wait. And that's why there's often a backlog of stuff happening in academia, is because there's not a good way to get it out if it isn't through a conference. Then the other thing there too is conferences typically only accept 10, maybe 20% of the papers they get. So that's the other thing, is that other 80 to 90%, that information has to wait for another conference, maybe the second year conference, maybe years later. So no matter what, somebody's research is always getting turned down. There's a lot of stuff that isn't coming out that people can't get citations from. So all of a sudden you're in this scenario where not only is it all the information isn't getting out quickly, it's like some of it may never come out. And there are some examples of really good papers that ended up completely changing computer science that were actually rejected for about 5 or 6 years before they finally got in, and they were able to change things because people didn't understand, because the reviewers didn't quite understand how that paper changed things because it was too out there. So there are things like that that can happen here too.
What industries are either much better or much worse than that standard average?
So right now I'm talking about it from an academic perspective, and so this is mainly talking about computer science.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, what other areas of research might be a lot better or a lot worse?
From what I understand, biology is a bunch worse. I had a few friends that have been working on papers there, and it took nearly 4 or 5 years before something got published. Especially if it's a lot of biology, from what I understand, is a public-private partnership, so you're often working with governments or companies and stuff like that, and they'll have trade secret restrictions, so they'll pay for the public researchers to help with things, but then not be able to release the information so it can get published, so that's often a problem too. There's also scenarios where in biology as well that, like computer science, there's maybe 2 authors on a paper, maybe up to 6. Like there's not a ton of people, but there are papers where I've seen 20 people on a single paper, and all of a sudden you have to make sure every single one of those people approves it before it goes through. And when you're talking about this public-private partnerships, you also have to run it through a company who's technically one of those authors, and they have to go through the information, which might go through several departments. So yeah, that's one factor.
Just as an example of this, Tim Berners-Lee's first paper in the World Wide Web was rejected. The reviewer said this will never scale.
I mean, there's some places it hasn't scaled gracefully. But it's very true. And so that's one of the things as well that, academics try and watch out for, is there's a whole process that each lab I've been in has gone through to make sure the papers are accessible, which will be a section I talk about here in a bit. But how people accept the papers is also different too. Different groups look for different things. You can often go on the websites and see for every conference what their suggested techniques for submitting a paper are. And some of them, it's like you must have 3 experiments in this single paper proving the same point for us to accept it. And it's like, that's a lot of work. That's nearly like 80 hours per experiment. And you're trying to put that in a paper, and if that 80 hours, it's usually spent with participants. So all of a sudden, you're doing the time before and after participants and all this sort of stuff. So it ends up adding up to a lot of time, and you only have 10 pages is another thing in computer science. Most conferences want no more than 10 pages, including references, which is hard. So
the citations are something that you can't get until you've made it all the way through this diagram. You have to be officially published and then you can.
yeah, so you have to be officially published, and somebody has to like your work enough to put it in their paper and cite it. And that's another problem here, is that there's often situations where if you're talking about this 10-page limit, sometimes instead of citing every paper that led to this conclusion or led to your work, you'll just cite the best one that covers the most points so you can have more space to write. And so all of a sudden you have to be not only a good citation, but the best citation that no one else can do better. And no one else can do, so there's some papers called systemization of knowledge papers, and they basically collect all of the ideas on one topic. And those ones are usually cited very well because people are like, oh, I can cite everything I need to in one paper without having to cite the individual papers, which is unfortunate. So it actually reduces citation count to have it be in the 10-page limit because people are doing too much wordsmithing trying to make it smaller. So now conferences are starting to have the citation, like the reference list separate, and you can do 10 pages plus that, but it's slow going. So I always try and pressure the conferences I submit to change that format. But that's one thing that really affects researchers. And these are conferences that typically I'm from information security, so these are the top conferences I try and get into. Out of these, only PETS is open access. It is the only one that anybody, regardless of whether they are in academia or industry, can get access to every single paper and every single tool. They also, in my opinion, have the best review process as well. They actually let you submit nonstop all year round, so you don't have to wait for the 1 year. They also do things where they shepherd you through the process. So if they don't like certain things about your paper, you can actually resubmit, or you submit it and the reviewers will actually review it multiple times until the quality of your paper goes up, which also means it's more likely to be accepted and stuff like that as well. They also have independent reviewers that check the math on the papers. So instead of trusting the random set of 3 reviewers that are typically on a paper, they have a separate shepherding process just for the math to make sure it's done correctly and all the formal proofs are verified. So if you're ever looking for open access papers, that's where I would start. Unfortunately, the rest of these are behind paywalls, but hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll understand how to get access to those. And how does industry work? From my experience, especially in InfoSec, it's conferences. Just straight conferences. And these are all ones that I've been to in the last year, and out of them, ShmooCon does ask all presenters for their papers, and promotes them putting out the white papers. But the thing that's different about academia and industry is there's no one reviewing the work. It's basically an opinion piece, it's a blog post, no one's checking it, no one's verifying it. There's no way to make sure as a third party reading the paper that it's actually truthful. So that's an unfortunate part of why academia takes longer, is because you're passing it through what is hopefully actually your enemies, because those people are more likely to want to rip apart your paper and find something wrong and tell you, haha, I found it. Whereas in industry, it's like white papers out there and they're like, yeah, it's got to be amazing. But if anybody, has anybody read the IOTA white paper, the cryptocurrency? Yeah, so it was a fairly short white paper on the cryptocurrency, and it's like, how do we plan to do security? And they're like, the best way. And so, you end up getting things like that in white papers where a reviewer would have been like, no, you have to explain that. So that's one of the differences that I see. And especially as somebody who's trying to help my undergrads, integrate both into academia and into industry, they ask, like, what can I actually trust? They constantly ask, like, what is a source that I can use? And it's interesting because in industry, when I've worked in jobs, people have said, just Google it. Just Google it, just find it, just go out there, just, there's so much on the internet. Of course, you'll find the perfect thing to read. But the undergrads I've been talking to always raise a good point, like, how do they know they can trust it? How do they know that the material is done correctly? Especially when you think of things like Stack Overflow and people putting their code on there are usually problems with security, where there's an obvious buffer overflow, but whoever's posted it doesn't actually do any security, so they don't know to check for buffer overflows. So would you use that code, or would you ask somebody for a good reference to do it? And so that's another thing that is really interesting that I would like to see change in industry is, have a place where people could put this information and review it back and forth as well before doing the white papers, to have that peer review process. But yeah, and again, a lot of this being in conferences as well, like, who actually sits there and wants to listen to a video for an hour, right? I mean, I do because I have to for my research, but it's not always fun because when you have a paper that's 10 pages, I'll go through like processes on how to read those fast and a few more slides, but you can't do it at your own pace. It is the pace of the conference and nothing more, nothing less, nothing more. And so that's also something that makes it quite difficult for academics to cite everything happening in industry is if it's in a conference video, you have to say, like, at this time, this is said exactly. You have to be able to make the transcripts from it, highlight it, do everything. And that's a lot of work for one researcher on one video for a single sentence. There are also situations where these blog posts, you're not allowed to actually talk about them as if they are fact unless it's an opinion about the opinion paper. So you can't actually say, this is exactly how this works. You have to be able to recreate it in a lab. And so when you see these white papers, you can't just cite it, you have to go in, you have to redo it yourself to be able to use it. Unless it's like, there's cases where WannaCry, people are like, oh yeah, this person did this to combat it. Then it's like, okay, yeah, you can cite the paper because you're commenting on the piece, not on a piece of the piece. So it makes it really hard to transfer that information back and forth. And like, I really want to cite more of you. It's very difficult. So now, like, what are some of the strategies that I've used? And the first one is like, learn how to find papers. This is something that I've been trying to coach people on in industry for a while. But they usually think it's like this, that as a researcher, I go directly to ACM and IEEE and get the paper out. But no, I use Google. Everybody uses Google. There used to be the idea of deep web searching, and you go to the library and the librarian would teach you how to do this like crazy awesome searching. No, everybody just uses Google now. Because Google Scholar usually does find you what you want. It's also how a lot of academics check each other's citation counts. That's actually what I was showing you in the beginning, was individual researchers' citation counts, because they look there instead of figuring out themselves now. So Google's the place to go. But the interesting thing is you can notice in the bottom corner how there's 118 versions of the one paper I was trying to find. And that's through so many sources. Because not only will ACM and IEEE put it out there, but researchers like having our information out. So you can actually go directly to a researcher to get any paper. I've had people email me to get my paper. I'm like, yeah, sure, of course. Like, tell me what you think about it. I'd love your critique. If you have any ideas, like, let me know. And I've done this to other researchers too. It's like, can you send me this paper? Like, I'm really interested, and I don't have access. And this is like when I wasn't in school for a bit. And they're more than happy to share, because that's how they get their information out there. That is how you build more collaborations. That's how you get companies willing to sponsor you. That's how you can do good private-public partnerships. This is how you can get more tools. And really, a lot of researchers are very altruistic as well, and just want to help others succeed, want to help others build the tools that they don't have time for, because like, there's so many meetings in academia. But this helps. And if you don't want to email them because that's too much of a step, it's usually on all their websites too, because that's how researchers learn about each other, is checking out their websites. And like, if you look at enough of them, it looks like the most garish peacock set of websites you will ever see. It's like, some of them still have marquee going. And it's like, I think the worse website you have, the better the professor you are. Like, it's one of those that's like, do you have like any Illuminati quotes? Yeah? Okay, you're probably a good researcher. So, but going on the websites and you see, like, it's basically showing off, like, oh yeah, I have 100 papers, look at all these, just scroll, just keep scrolling. And you do, to end up trying to find these papers. So even as somebody in industry who can't get behind the paywall, this is one way you can do it, is just going directly to their sites. So use Google Scholar, like everybody else, find the paper, look at the author names, and then go through and just like search them on the internet, find their website. Because one of the other things too is Google does rank universities higher than other sources usually. So if you just go to a regular web search, the professor's website should be one of the first things that come up, which is interesting. Another thing is going to libraries. A lot of libraries still get paper copies of journals that come out from conferences, because conferences usually take all their papers, throw it into like one copy, and like, it's a journal now, and it's like, yeah, okay, sure, whatever. But it ends up being basically everybody's paper in one book copy, and they'll still ship these to schools. Schools will still get copies because they want access to get behind the paywall, but part of that service is still receiving paper copies even though they don't need them. So if you happen to be near a university, this is something you can usually check out as well.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
I've actually had a lot of luck getting really hard to get journal articles from interlibrary level. Just go to the public library and give them like the exact DOI that you want, and they'll like go through like the WhisperNet and talk to each other, and like you'll end up with something that's been photocopied probably 12 times with like an old Xerox machine, but it still works.
Hand pressed.
Yeah.
Well, and that's another thing too, is there are a couple groups that I don't want to reveal on camera, but you can talk to me after, that are on Twitter, and they follow certain hashtags. And if you say, I need this paper, and then use the hashtag, you'll get a mysterious paper to your inbox from an email you've never seen before. Because, like, librarians are badass. Circumventing censorship, like, it's amazing. But all you have to do is, like, put the paper title and put your email, and yeah, you'll get a mysterious paper in your inbox. Which is really cool, because I've talked to some of the people involved in this project, and they actually had somebody come in and teach them how to strip out the metadata, how to like get all the information out of it and stuff like that, which is really exciting that they actually have a lot of knowledge on how to get around some of the, I'm sure you have heard about like the dots and stuff that are embedded into some of the pictures that you can't necessarily see. And it's like, yeah, the librarians are like, we know how to get rid of that now. And it's like, yay, I'm so proud of you.
So you said that researchers can share their own papers however they want. How does that work versus like, how do paywalled sites exist if researchers can give away their own stuff, or can they just not make like a conglomeration of researchers?
So it's really interesting. One of the ways this happens, especially in Canada, is we actually have an open access clause on all of our funding from the government. That sure, one of these journals can put things away for a year, but then after that, it's open access. And the researchers are not allowed to waive that requirement because it's part of their funding. So it's something they automatically accept, and they can't give away that copyright on behalf of the company that's giving them their funding. And that's the government of Canada, and that's like, I mean, they give out so much money to our researchers, so it's one of those things where basically everybody has that funding, and even if you don't, your professor does, so all of our research basically has that on it. In the States, it's a bit more difficult because there is, from what I understand, a more severe restriction on it. But it's one of those things where talked to a few profs about this, and what they've said is basically like if they weren't allowed to post things, they would just probably find different ways to do it, which is why you get things like pets, is because they're actively trying to make sure that people are able to spread the knowledge, but they get the money from people going to the conference and a lot of donation and stuff like that. So that's how they keep going. But now places like ACM and IEEE, how they're making a lot of their money is by suggesting papers to you and trying to operate as a search engine. If you actually watch your internet traffic while you were going through the ACM website, there's so many trackers and so many redirects before you actually go. So if you click and it takes a while, it's because they're redirecting you through several sites, and they're using those metrics to prove to schools why they're useful and make the money. So they're charging them money to prove that they need money. It's really weird. But yeah, so that's part of the service they're now offering, is this idea that they can tell the conferences they host as well, how many people are reading their papers, how influential they are as a conference compared to others, and all these other things. So they're trying to basically be the Facebook of research, and it's not that great. Yeah, so, and it's one of those things that I'm pretty sure researchers would do it anyway, but that's why there's Elsevier is one of the other journals, and why a lot of researchers are pulling out of that company is because they've actually gone after people who have posted their papers. So it's one of those things where I think it was Germany or Sweden, can't remember, but one of them basically said, yeah, like you're not allowed to publish them anymore because they're so bad. And so it's to the fact where there's governments that are acting against journals because they're screwing it up too much. So that's one of the things that ACM IEEE is like kind of now being a little bit more open about.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but except in the cases of, let's say, federal officials, in the U.S., most journals, you actually sign away the copyright, so the journal actually owns the copyright to your work. So technically that professor who like has a bad PDF is like breaking the law in some small way.
Yeah, but it's one of those things that everybody does it. And I'm pretty sure if they tried to go against every prof at once, it would be just too much for them to deal with. So it's one of those like, okay, we see what you're doing, but like, you shouldn't be doing that. Yeah, and which is why like, some people have said like, are you sure you should be giving this talk? Are you sure you should be giving this talk? And my response is like, if this information is out there and people start accessing knowledge even for a while and it's more open, that makes me more happy, because then if we get to the point where somebody does try and go after the professors, then we can actually maybe fix the problem. So we'll see. But there's lots of opinion on this.
So, I'm in bioresearch, and I know that at least in the journals that I kind of run with, you can pay extra money for open access. So usually under like closed access, you pay a certain rate to get your thing published. But then if you want to
The
pay
researchers
more,
pay more?
yes, the researcher has to pay more. So I've got to pop up an extra $1,200 so that I can like retain the copyright or to have open access copyright to it.
Thanks if you ever do that.
Yes. Or you know,
Access people.
or you can just support those journals. Have open access.
Is there a way around this if, say, for example, you publish like a rough draft first?
So there's groups like Archive, ARXIV, but it's usually what we also label our garbage bin. Because usually when it's on Archive, it hasn't been peer reviewed. Because when you're trying to publish the paper, you actually sign away the copyright when you submit the paper to get peer reviewed. So it's before anybody else has seen it. So that's one of the things as well, is you are getting the garbage version. Although that's different in math. Apparently Math Archive is like the gold standard, and I'm like, don't understand it, but if you're reading computer science papers on Archive, no, just don't.
What if it's like really similar to like the published paper, but it's just like.
But how would you know?
Clean up the grammar or fix something or something.
So sometimes it can be something as simple like a greater than sign becoming a greater than or equal to. It might be a change that small, but how would you know, right? Because it's a PDF, like it's not the easiest thing to necessarily grep on. So that's an issue too, is like how do you know what the changes have been and how do you know what point is made better? Because the grammar bit might be the most obvious, but who knows? And that's
when you try to do it, your code will crash. Or the algorithm won't work, it'll be unstable or something.
right. But do you want to spend the hours doing that or just get the version that works?
That's a good point.
No one likes crashing code. So there's little problems like that, or I mean that's usually like some of my greatest problems when I'm programming my robots is somebody put a double equals instead of a greater than equals, and it's like, yeah, okay, and the AI tried to kill us. So like, do you want that issue? And it could be something that small, but that, you know, going through the peer review process, that is the whole point, is to find those issues. But yeah, in Canada anyway, I don't know, we never pay to publish our stuff ever. And like if you're paying to publish your stuff, it's like you shouldn't be doing that, is what we usually do. But there is like the just general Canadian rider for, oh yeah, you're Canadian? Okay, this will be free in a year. So, because that's how our funding works. And even Americans can do that as well. They can add their own rider in. You just have to hope they read it and stuff and that they've signed off on it, which a lot of them will do, especially if you have a Canadian co-author, so you should collaborate. And so there's options like that too, is depending on which country you're with and what their laws are regarding giving away copyright and all that sort of stuff, who your collaborators are can make a big difference too. No, this is good. I like the conversation.
So the NCBI, which is for biotechnology, they do try to work with publishers to have what they call PubMed Central. So after like a 6-month cooling period or 1-year cooling period, can open access and actually publish that on the NCBI website. So there are things out there, but yeah.
There are plenty of channels. It's great. So this is why when a lot of companies are like, we can't get access to papers, I'm like, there are tons of ways to get papers. You just have to kind of search around a bit more. But like going back to that one slide I had on Google showing 118 versions, that's basically it, is, you know, one person publishes it, usually ACM, then the authors will all publish it, maybe there's 4 or 5 authors, and then usually you upload it to your school as well. That's what I've had to do in all my Canadian schools, is upload it to the schools, so then you have all those researchers, and if they're from different schools, all of a sudden they're publishing it there. So now you've already got 11 versions, like if you have 5 authors. And then depending on, like from there, it just keeps going, especially if somebody transfers universities, Like maybe they're a master's student one place, PhD student someplace, and they'll publish it on both, and then on and on and on. So it does get more and more prolific over time, which is interesting. But then this is often something I get as well, is academic papers are too difficult to read. A bad paper is a bad paper. This is one of my favorite researchers in InfoSec, Matt Blaze, and this is common, is if it's hard to read in poor English, doesn't state their contributions, misstates the related work by using the wrong information or wrong citations, or they have incomprehensible graphs that don't have even an axis and nothing's labeled. Like, yeah, International Journal of Badly Described Research. No one wants to read it. No one wants to have that information out there. These are the papers that are part of that 80 to 90% that don't get published, are the ones that honestly just need more work. Like, just actually go through and try to make a good paper. And there's plenty of books, especially in English departments. I took the one course last year, and the interesting thing there was that we looked at how paper writing has changed so much. And now it kind of has to be a story that grips you. You can't just state cold facts and be like point form. It's too dense. No one wants to read it. You're going to get rated badly because no one wants to make that slog. And like the reviewers are just going to want to rate you lower anyway. But if you make it a pleasure to read and you use simple words, the suggested level is, I think, a grade 6 reading level, and try to use words like there at that point or lower is the best way to do it. And there's all these strategies for how to develop papers. So yeah, you think a paper's bad to read. We also think it's bad to read as academics. We don't want to read it. So it's part of that as well, is that we're getting to the point where if you're reading modern papers, they're actually, I have fun reading them. Like, I actually get upset when somebody interrupts me while I'm reading a paper. I'm like, I'm getting to the good part. Like, it just gets really exciting sometimes, especially like with the robot stuff.
So why do you think it wasn't always that way, and why do you think it's become?
It's because a lot more people are getting into research. Like, even if you just look at the enrollment rates at universities, right? There's so many more people that are going into university because it is more accessible. And I don't know if a lot of you have noticed, but where are all the junior roles, right? Is a lot of the junior positions where you get a lot of mentorship, a lot of hands-on training, and kind of like how people are trained in the trades is happening in universities now. And a lot of companies are offloading that onto universities. So you get more people there, and part of that is, once you're in university, the professor's like, I need more papers, who's my undergrad, who's gonna write my papers? And then you get that scenario where you get way more people into the, well, in Canada anyway, you get a lot of people into the labs, you get a lot more people doing grad research now these days as well. And so there's more time to critique, there's more papers to critique, there's a lot more content out there, so they can start choosing the better papers. And because we're all optimizing for citations, then it gets to the point where, okay, now we're writing better papers because we're trying to impress people because we need the citations because there's more competition, and then it's kind of like a self-feedback loop. So it's because I feel it's because there's a much higher rise in that competitive factor.
I'm going to push back a little bit because I think that there's more people out there, and so there's a little bit of a balance where, there's public and parish, and so I think a lot of the stuff, like, it's pushed through, even though the researchers themselves might know it's junk because they need to, like, get so many before their tenure reviews coming up or something like that. And so I actually really look forward to when I have to read old papers, like from the 1940s and 50s, like every once in a while I have to dig those out. And like back then, I don't think there was quite that comparative. So I don't know, I think maybe like we were going through a period where like there's a lot of junk, just because people needed to publish, and maybe hopefully people now understand that it's still going to be interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And although when I read old papers, I'm like, I don't understand half these words because how they've been used in the English language has changed so much that I'm like, I need like an old school, old English dictionary with like E at the end of old. Like going back and reading some of like Turing's seminal papers are just like, okay, I got through a page. Yep, I'm going for a walk. I'll be back. And it's not because the content's necessarily hard because they teach it in second-year computer science now, but it's because it's honestly just a slog to get through. Like, I tried to read classic books a while ago, and just because, like, oh, they're classics, gotta read them. And it's like 10 pages, and I'm like, this isn't fun for anyone. So, but that's part of it, is you know, especially when you get to the point where a reviewer says, you know, I wish a reviewer recommendation was resubmit to a venue for which I'm not a reviewer. Like, if they hate it that much, I wish you could put that in the reviews, but you can't because it's mean. But it's one of those things where some people so much hate the papers because they're just not well put together, where a simple reframing might make it better, and that's where I think a lot of people are the publish and perish and trying to make it more accessible, more interesting, so you don't get that comment back.
So I'm going to apologize in advance. I don't read many academic papers, but
I'll teach you how.
what classifies as like a good paper? Random JavaScript library. Like, could I write a paper on that, or does it have to be like truly groundbreaking?
So you said it writing a JavaScript library?
Just a random thing. Like what? Like if I wanted to write an academic paper, like what is good content for that?
So the thing my prof always says, it has to be science. So there are things like we had somebody in our lab write or change the simulator for Tor. It's called Shadow, and he put a lot of effort into it. But building a tool is not science, it's building a tool. So the science is how much did you increase the, how much information is able to go through it? Did you change something and it increased this rate? Like if you have a number you can show of change, or if you can show, for example, I do a lot of user studies, like can I use this robot to break into a space? How often can I do it? And so that would be science because I can prove that if I recreate the scenario over and over, that I have this much chance of being able to do this. Therefore, we can assume, you know, if I put cookies on a robot, it can probably break into a building, right? So there's stuff like that that I get to do, but that's science because I'm dealing with the numbers, I'm setting up a scenario, it's, you know, that sort of thing. So when it comes to a paper, like I said, some conferences are requiring you to do 3 experiments for one paper because they really want to prove that number is correct. But other things are sometimes just a really, really good theory that you've spent hours and hours and hours and days and months and weeks of your life, like I have, on trying to get an idea so solid that no one can attack it and saying like, putting out, I'm going to define this new thing. I've defined it really well. Here, try and beat it down. And that's like a good paper as well, because then you're challenging somebody to be like, hey, do you think you can break this idea? So that's how a theory paper works, but otherwise, yeah, numbers and showing that you can do something. Does that make sense? Okay. So the other thing here is learning how to read papers. I hated reading papers 2 years ago. I was just like, what do you mean I have to read 60 papers in like 60 days? I'm like, no? Can we not do this? Can I read half of them? And it was just like really daunting to me because I would take hours going through them. But there's this paper by one of the profs at my university, Keshov, and I added citations. And this is how he suggests reading papers. Is starting with the abstract so you know what you're getting into. Like, what is the point of this? Where is it starting? Where is it ending? That sort of thing. Then just reading all of the headings, like going through and just seeing like what they think they're talking about and going through it. Because that gives you an idea in your head, like of the framework of where this information is going to go, what's leading to what, like what exactly are you getting into on a little bit bigger of a scale. Then reading the intro, and because usually intro, they're setting up everything they're going to do. And the conclusion should mirror the intro. It should solve everything they said they were going to do in the intro, so then you read the conclusion. And by then you should know where the paper's going, where it started, all of that. The only difference is now you need the details. So then you do the full read through. And that's where most people can stop, is at step 5. And the full read through is just like beginning to end go, because you already know where everything's going. You don't have to think, okay, now what's happening, because you already know. So that's kind of fun. And that's where I recommend like all my undergrads stop, is just so they understand the material enough to like talk about it with somebody else, to really like just have those conversations. But step 6 is what I do as a grad student, which is critiquing it, which is making, like going through and saying, oh, this study, 18 to 20-year-olds, that was all university students. They did not go outside university students. These results aren't general, they are university student results, because that happens a lot. And that's a critique, is understanding like where the information is actually coming from. And that's super common with the participants, especially in robot studies, is they end up being between 18 and 25, and it's like, excellent. or like realizing if it's all females or all males. That's often a problem as well, especially when I'm doing stuff with robots and personality stuff and emotional reactions. There's a huge difference between the genders in some respects, mainly in gays is the biggest difference. Is when a robot stares at people, there's a bunch of really cool stuff that happens. But I have to be able to go through the critique and see, like, is this balanced? Is it not balanced? Because it's going to change, like, how much I actually get out of this result. So when you're doing that step, that's kind of intense, and that's, you really need to know the information inside and out rather than a passing, which just want to kind of learn things.
Do you think that the papers themselves should be ordered in this way?
No. I think they're organized well. I just think this is a way to familiarize yourself with the content. So one of the big things is often people try and overdo it. They try to put themselves too into it right away. And they'll just read the entire 10-page paper without knowing whether it's even worth it. And it's like, oh my God. But sometimes if you just read the intro and the conclusion and abstract and headings, you know whether you want to do a full read-through. There's a number of papers I've tossed after reading the conclusion. I'm like, yeah, you did not do anything you meant to.
Would you always read through it this way?
I have been, especially because abstract, 3 minutes. That's your first read-through. Headings into a conclusion, that should be 10 minutes. Done. Then if you do a full read-through after that, your average reading time should be maybe half an hour. And you should be able to get enough information out of it. And then the critique I usually do is 2 hours. And that's the difference, is instead of most people, when they read through a paper from beginning to end, the first time they're reading it, they're trying to do the critique style, and they end up taking hours and hours. And they don't know whether the paper is worth it. They don't know if it's actually related to their project. But by doing it the other way, you end up spending maybe 40 minutes on it instead of like 2 to 3 hours. So that's why I'd recommend it this way. But I'd still have papers in the way they are, because when you do the full read through, it makes sense. But yeah, and then you get to this point, where if you finished the abstract, the intro, the conclusions, do you still care about it? Yes or no? So you either throw it away because it's garbage and not related to anything you want to do, or you cite and use it. I forgot to switch that to an and sign. But that's the thing, is being able to cite it back really helps bridge that gap, and I think that's back and forth too. Like whenever I try and teach somebody something, I always try to throw the video on. That's why there's been the citations at the bottom, because when these slides come out, you'll be able to go and see exactly what I'm talking about. And it's that helps us support each other, and that's something that I find, especially when I go to conference talks, it's like, yeah, but have you talked to this person or this person about this content? Like after I've seen a talk, and they're like, oh yeah, of course, they did that part. I'm like, then why aren't you citing them? Why aren't you showing where this information comes from so people can really get into the topic instead of acting like this is all my work and no one else's? It really sets a bad precedent for how much effort really goes into these things and how much effort other people actually put in as well. Like, this saved me so many hours. And like, I feel I would be just absolutely terrible if I didn't recommend like Keshov's paper for everybody to read it, because this is the full summary of it, but giving him the opportunity to have more citations on his paper is what I can do to kind of support the whole network.
So when you cite something, how does that add to the sum of whoever knows how many citations it's been?
So this is kind of actually really messy, because what will happen is a lot of the journals talk to each other, and they'll do counts, and when you upload a paper, when you're doing a submission, usually the bibliography is a separate file, or there's ways that they can pull it out. And what happens is then they can see who's citing what, and they can see like who is the publisher, and then they can pull that information out and add it to their own numbers, send those numbers to the other journals. But then if you want to figure that out, you'd have to like go through each one and find your own citations. But no, Google Scholar does it. And it doesn't do it well, mind you, because a lot of people actually put spelling errors in their bibliography. I've been working on that all frickin' week, is as I've been going through papers seeing that, oh yeah, this DOI doesn't work. Oh, this title is wrong. Oh, they think that's 2 separate papers, but it's the same paper because they wrote it wrong. And so there's all these issues actually in the review, in the referencing process. So I've got a bunch of errors I submitted to the DOI process to try and fix that. But Google Scholar just pulls things from papers, so it's a bit of a mess. So you kind of hope Google Scholar's right, and it's approximately right, so you kind of just, they have around this many citations. But by putting it in papers, and that's primarily the way the citations are counted, is through the journal papers. But being able to do that, and any industry person can also submit to academic conferences as well. So, I mean, that's the way we could all sort of help each other is, more papers back and forth, but, maybe the people that are in industry doing the conference talks do the paper and then do the talk in all the places too, right? So, yeah, citations are a mess. But yeah, and then these are ways that you can actually start bridging the gap as well, from both sides. So one of the big things that also helps both academic and industry people is doing presentations, right? It always looks good on a resume when you have, oh yeah, I did like these 5 presentations at this place or this other place, because in industry it shows that you can have those public speaking skills. In academia, it counts in Canada at least as your media and press coverage to show how like snazzy you'll be for the school. And it's something we actually put on our funding grants is for NSERC, our government funding, there's actually a section to put in every time you've done a public presentation, every time you've appeared in the media, every time you've done an interview. And they actually use that information to judge whether you should get the funding or not, because it makes Canada look better, it makes the university look better, it helps for publicity for everybody if you're that type of researcher. So anytime a company can invite me to speak somewhere, it's like, yeah, of course I'm gonna go do that. I want funding one day. So that's a benefit as well. I really feel both sides. I've also had a number of people who've spoken at Google, and that's been enough for an academic to get a public-private partnership with Google later on so they can get funding for research that they otherwise wouldn't get enough funding for, especially when it's large machinery. So it's just one of those things where if you really put yourself out there or other people put themselves out there, it's a little bit of back and forth. And that's something we do in my lab is we do invite people from industry to come speak at the school quite often as well. This is another thing really worth pushing is open source hardware and software. It is what a lot of schools are starting to do, is students are pushing to get their own intellectual property rights on their research. A number of universities won't let students keep their IP. And this is a major problem because then if they make something that could be used in their own company later on that they decide to make or anything like that, all of a sudden they can't because it's owned by the school. So that's why I chose the school I did, is because they let all students keep their intellectual property. And then that way we can make it open source. We can just be like, here, anybody who wants a censorship circumvention tool, go for it. Anybody who wants to be able to make their code so it's generated in a way that you can't tell who coded it so you don't reveal information about yourself. That's another tool we have out there. And there's tons of tools coming out of universities that are open source now. And it's also the same back that really helps researchers. It's like, I love it when I don't have to recreate the wheel, literally. Like, it is fantastic to be able to use open source hardware so I don't have to sit there and develop a new piece of anything. So Great Scott Gadgets, for example, I've been using their radio software and hardware to mess with my robots, and it's nice that I didn't have to do that all from scratch. So that's something that can really happen back and forth, is just making your things open source whenever you can and putting on the licenses so it can be used by companies, because technically universities do count as companies as well in some places. So if you really want to help like worldwide, it's important to make it truly open source and don't put a rider on for, companies can't use this, because it does harm some individuals both in academia and obviously in industry. Let's help each other out instead of each person doing the same thing over and over.
Are there like different licenses for hardware ideas than there are for other soft ideas, like words ideas? I never even realized there was a distinction before, actually.
So that's one of the interesting things is like when you get into patents and how like certain pieces of machinery work and stuff like that. I believe there's a difference. I have other people I can recommend you talk to. I could get that to you within 24 hours if you'd like.
Yeah, it's probably not urgent, because I didn't realize it was a problem until right now.
At least in the US, like software is copyright intrinsically, right? Like when you say get like written words, like a story, right? It's copyright.
hardware does not, but you can get patents. So it's like hardware, you can copy hardware as much as you want, unless there's a patent for it, then you can't at all.
But you can patent software too.
Yes.
Well,
If it's a specific process, it is the process of the software that can be patented.
The algorithm.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing there too is if you want to create hardware, don't read patents. Because if you don't read the patent, you can't be copying it. And so there's actually like a danger to you for reading the patent.
That's legit.
Yeah.
Like, what about the whole like first to file thing versus like first to
If you don't read it, you haven't copied it. But if you then go to file it, then you have to make a check before you go to file it. So if you don't file it and you don't want to like claim the patent, you're fine.
What if you erase the dots in the pictures and they can't tell that you read it?
So this is how a few people I know who are in open source hardware deal with it, is they just never ever read a patent and they don't go to patent websites, nothing. Because they just don't want to accidentally stumble upon it. Because if they do, then it's like, oh shit, and they can't do that anymore. But if no one's claimed it on them, then they're like, I haven't copied, I didn't know how this works. So it's like, it's a really interesting, shitty environment, and I think there shouldn't be any patents, but I'm that type of person.
So I work in software, and if I was looking for open source software, I would just like go to Google for it. If you were looking for open source hardware, I suppose people could document it online, but how would you go about searching for open source hardware?
I literally type in open source hardware. But there is the open source hardware group. So you,
There's like a group or catalog.
yeah, so like if you ever heard of OshPark, that's one group worth looking at. A lot of people I know work through them. That's not as much my jam, but again, if you want somebody within 24 hours, I can definitely give you links. But yeah, so that's a actually fairly large group, and there's the Open Hardware Summit as well. That's worth checking out. I think it's in Boston this year in November. And I'm sure if you look at that website, you'd be able to see a lot of the companies that do have open source hardware. And so that's an interesting thing too, is a lot of people don't know that open hardware is a thing. So it's kind of interesting to see how people react to it and whether they start making open source hardware. So, yeah. And then the next thing is, especially when it comes to academics, offering to take over projects. Because after you've spent 5 years on your PhD on the same tool, you are done. You're like, I don't ever want to touch this. I am not excited about it. And usually there's, is it the next slide? No, I guess I got rid of that slide. Usually when academics make tools, we're not making it for anybody to see the code. And so you're just getting through it because you're like, goddamn thesis, gotta get this finished, and you're trying to do your best to just get it done. And when you're applying for jobs, they're like, yeah, give us your GitHub. It's like, I'm not putting that on GitHub. It's because it looks like garbage. It works, it does what it's supposed to, but somebody should really go through it and refactor it. Somebody should probably do better variable names and not call a variable this fucking thing again. Like, it's probably not the best idea. And so it makes it a huge barrier for academics to putting their stuff on stuff like GitHub, is because it's like no one should ever see this code. It should never see the light of day, but it's a useful tool, and it did what it needed to do for the thesis. But the part of the thesis is, again, real science. Building a tool isn't science. It's what numbers you can get out of it, right? And so they'll be like, yeah, I got my results, we're good, burn it. And that doesn't help anybody. And so this is one thing that people can offer to do, is offer to take on the project privately and just say, you know, when you are done with this tool, because I've read your papers, because now you know how to find them, you go through and say, I would be happy to do a review on this, I would be happy to refactor this for you, I'd be happy to really do the software engineering on this project to really redesign it and do what needs to be done to get it public. And that can really help researchers out, is, you know, somebody willing to do that. So offering to take over the project. Yep.
Do you think so? Like, there have been a couple. I've done that to a couple things. Like, some of them were work projects, and the code was terrible. But it wasn't to, like, I didn't collaborate with the researcher at all. They just had they put their code somewhere, and then we adapted it for one of the things we're working on. But I had the impression that they wouldn't be interested in. That they just weren't interested in it at all.
Did you email them?
I did.
Well, there you go. You've got to communicate.
But I mean, do you think researchers would in general would be willing to like waste time like explaining how their stuff works?
Many would be, because like on one hand it's your baby, it's a malformed ugly baby, but if somebody else is willing to take it in and like make it better, and then you're like, yeah, okay, I can put some effort in now. Like if somebody else is willing to help me, you know, it really helps, because it's a huge burden, especially when you're graduating, right? You're graduating, you're moving, you're getting a job, maybe you're trying to get a visa at the same time. There's so many stresses happening at once, and you're like, I'm gonna get back to that project once things settle down. When do things ever settle down, right? And so especially like after you spend so much time on it and you go back to it and you're like, oh, this is ugly, I don't wanna like do this. So that's one of the things that can really help, is being like, yeah, I see you have like this project, are you planning to put it on GitHub? If no, like is there a reason why that I can help with? Like just saying that, reaching out and being a good neighbor is a good way to start. And I really feel it goes the other way too, is like academics, we do a lot of like crazy things because we have the protection of the university. And if you're in a scenario where it's like, I would really love to do this and check this like usability part of this project, I'm not a usability person, this is a side project, maybe I could talk to somebody from a university and see like, could they help out? Because sometimes that's a way to do it too, is talking to an undergrad. Like, I love undergrads. But even talking to a grad student who's looking for a project, right? Or talking to an undergrad that's about to go into their master's, having that project is a big like hurdle to get over. Not everybody's lucky knowing exactly what they want to solve in their master's, but offering them like, hey, this thing, can we make this better so we can help, you know, this part of the world or this thing in the world? And offering that up is also a way to make that collaboration happen. And I've helped a bunch of groups do this now, so I can tell you more stories about that after. And public-private partnerships, I think I've beaten that horse to death. And then because I do like my citations, this is one talk that does go more in depth on a lot of these topics, particularly when it comes to how to do research. I'd highly suggest that. This one is a big talk on open source and opening up knowledge and getting that information out there as well. But I think that is my hour. So thank you very much.